When I first started thinking about this video, I thought about possibly doing it on the history of comics. It's a rich history that has arguably lasted the entirety of humanity, or at least the entirety of time that humans were making art. But then I got a little distracted, and I mostly blamed this book. Let me explain. As I was researching the materials needed for the history project, understanding comics by Scott McCloud was either referenced, recommended, or flat out required to learn more about comics. So I read it. And now you're getting this video instead of the history of comics video. And trust me, it's more interesting than it sounds. What got me so pulled into Scott's book was how much he broke down the process of reading and engaging with comics. How there was so much more than just spandex and bright colors. And since it was structured to literally look like a comic book, the level of self-referential examples was both entertaining and enlightening. It also showed me terminology that I had known just from general knowledge and made me think about those terms over again. For example, I know what motion is in a very real sense, but how does an artist convey that motion in a static picture? Terms like these were also partnered with terms that I hadn't encountered before, like closure, which is a term to describe how your brain sees two separate pictures and can create an implied meaning between them. Pulling all of that together, we'll be able to acknowledge that reading comics is still reading, despite whatever your third grade teacher said about them. Something is missing in their overall critique, and it isn't their fault. It's just that reading comics is a different style of reading, one that often better suits some students for a variety of different reasons. From Superman to Sandman to Saga, comics continue to explore themes and situations that were once only seen as those of serious literature. Comics are important, and do have a place in the realms of art and literature. So, let's see what makes them tick. What is a comic? And I know, that sounds like a pretty easy question to answer. Scott McCloud thought so too. He knew comics as the bright magazines filled with bad art, stupid stories, and guys in tights, which were his words. But he clearly didn't keep that particular opinion, considering a good chunk of his career has gone into the crafting and exploration of comics. He moved past the idea that comics weren't, quote, real books, and saw something deeper, something beyond the panels and colors. It nagged at him as he began to structure his life to lead down the path of becoming a comic book artist and cartoonist. And the whole trip down that path, he was always asking himself the deceptively simple question, what is a comic? Which culminated into the publication of his book, Understanding Comics in 1993. Scott relied on several different scholarly works focused on comics, often called comics studies, to complete this and several other books he created around studying and making comics. One of the main starting points with comic studies looks at the work of Roland Barthes and Umberto Eco. These were philosophers who looked at how we, humans, developed using symbols and images to pass on information, or what's called semiotics. So Scott and other scholars used the research of semiotics to explore what is a comic and why and how our creation of symbols to communicate connects to comic. If you're starting to feel your eyelids get heavy at the mention of academia and philosophy, never fear. We're going to do something even more fun. Define words. Alright, it doesn't sound that fun at all, but solidifying the terms will help us understand comics while you read them. The first term I'm going to define is the term comics, or how Scott defines the term comics. And he does this with the help of comic book legend Will Eisner. Eisner called comic books, quote, sequential art, which seems like it would be the best fit. But by that definition, a film, or like the film celluloid, would be considered a comic if you focused on it frame for frame. Scott wanted to remove all of the possibilities of splitting hairs to arrive at comics being called a juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. So, academic gobbledygook and a fancy way of saying pictures and or drawings arranged in a way that is specific and in a specific style. Not much better, but that's what we're working with. The next term describes the vehicle for us, the reader, to see the, quote, juxtaposed pictorial and other images, and these are called panels. Panels are the boxes that account for the image that the creator was directing you to, with the exact number of panels and style being fluid. Some pages have many panels, some have a few, and sometimes the full page is the panel. But regardless of how many panels end up being on that page, creators of comics from Europe and the US intend for the reader to treat the panels as they would sentences and words in a text-based book. You start at the top left corner and you go down the page left to right. Japanese comics, or manga, however, are a bit different. You start on the, quote, last page of the book, starting in the top right corner and going down the page from right to left. In all comics, there's a space between each of the panels, and this is called the gutter. Comic books make the gutter very clearly defined and have neutral space to create the separation of the panels, whether it be in white ink, black ink, or any other color ink that there is. Each piece of art that a creator uses needs to be distinct from one panel to the next to remove the confusion for the visual aspect of the comic. So a comic without gutters negates part of the definition of what a comic book is, stopping the juxtaposed art from being sequential. But as we look at this, quote, juxtaposed art in sequential order, we find some way to connect it all together. It's closure that gives us the overall story the panels are trying to tell. Closure is the process of your brain understanding the whole of something from just its parts. Essentially, it's the act of deducing and inducing. It's your brain creating the story by piecing together the separate parts, or the panels, to make sense. Knowing this, some creators format the order of the panels or pages to disrupt that process, creating tension and pushing the story forward to resolve the tension. Closure is an important process for us as readers to make the connection a creator wants us to make. I'm not unveiling some kind of secret truth when I say that comic books are static or unmoving images. It comes with the nature of print media. But numerous comics show and rely on the feeling of movement. Does Superman really go faster than a speeding bullet just because we're told he does? Or is Speed Racer really a demon on wheels because his theme song says he is? We can understand that within the world of these comic books, these characters are moving as fast as they are because of how the artist has drawn them. There are several ways that artists tend to do this, and neither way is the only way. There are two very common ways that we see it a lot, and the first is the usage of lines either trailing an item or character or overlapping copies of whatever is moving. This signals to the reader that whatever has this particular effect drawn near it or on it or around it is moving. Artists tend to fine-tune the lines that are drawn to try and establish the implied speed. Another way that creators denote motion requires the image's background. This is often seen in Japanese comics or mangas. The subject in the foreground or in the front of the picture is focused, is clear, and the background is drawn to give it the appearance of moving quickly by. For example, if you were in a car which was moving quickly down the street and you took a picture of your friend who was also in the backseat with you, they would look great, but in the background would be all blurred out and fuzzy. That is the imagery that the artist is trying to emulate to signal that whatever is in focus is also in motion. This is what I would like to call the Speed Racer effect. Speed is crystal clear in the driver's seat, with no lines of motions marked around him as he is in focus, but his background looks like as if someone tried to wipe the ink away. It's streaked and unclear of what is truly behind him. Both are completely acceptable styles of a creator letting you know that something is moving in this picture, even when, reality, it's stationary on the page. What I think is one of the coolest tricks that comics make is creating the subjectivity of time. For the most part, a panel is intended to be a single moment in a scene, and as the scene progresses, there are more and more panels, which also indicates that time passes. But sometimes there is a scene that is represented by just the one panel, implying that everything is happening at the same time, but also has its own beats to it. In Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud uses this panel as an example of the bendability of time. The multiple actions and conversations give the sense that all of this can happen in the single panel, and you, the reader, are given the path to follow where to go from beat to beat, with how the creator places the word bubbles or the physical placements of the characters. But you also know that there is a rhythm to what's going on in that frame. Scott makes a note that this whole sequence would still make sense if the creator shifted from the single panel to a multi-panel sequence. The overall scene still makes sense from one section to the next, but there feels less energy in the room when they're all separated in that way. And this can happen vice versa, with a single moment being divided up into rapid beats, even if almost no time passes in the context of the comic book itself.
So what? Why does this matter? It's just kids' books. I mean, there's pictures.
Alright, I'll point towards something that's true that we don't acknowledge a lot. Reading is a skill, not a talent. Some people can pick it up faster than others, that's true, but that doesn't mean that a slow starter is always going to be bad at it forever. It takes practice to continue to develop this skill and feel more and more comfortable reading increasingly difficult materials. However, that isn't exactly the way that reading is often practiced. Reading often feels more like work or punishment than something to enjoy. I know that the books that I read throughout my time in school turned many of my fellow students off from reading, with the biggest issue being that they weren't entertaining. Even though I do enjoy reading, it's not an unfair complaint. I remember very few titles that I read in school from when I was growing up, and it's not a big leap to see how comics were the more appealing form of reading for the students, despite many teachers holding the belief that comics aren't real books. But again and again, librarians and researchers have seen the value of comics and graphic novels in getting those reluctant readers. And as time goes on, more and more titles are being released with an adult audience in mind, not just for the subject matter, but for the quality of writing as a whole too. Creators like Alan Moore come to mind, who produced massive and dense works that are also still entertaining, such as From Hell, which is about the Jack the Ripper murders, and Watchmen, which is a criticism of our love for superheroes and why they could be destructive in the end. Also, the vocabulary of comic books rivals that of even adult fiction. Research from the University of Oregon Center on Teaching and Learning revealed that graphic novels have an average of 53.5 rare words per thousand. The average fiction book has an average of 52.7 words per thousand. The children's books average about 30.9 rare words per thousand. So the reluctant reader is engaging with something that they find both entertaining and is secretly building a stronger vocabulary.
Comics have gotten a bad rap within the cultural zeitgeist of literacy, often accused of being niche or childish. I'm not sure these are fair charges. They have a whole language of their own to define the different parts and evoke how we read them, creating visual patterns that may differ from region to region, but are almost universal. Comics are also often considered more of a genre like fantasy or horror, but I don't think this is true either. I think that they are their own style of writing, taking a seat at the table of literature with such heavy hitters as poetry, memoir, and journalism. Thanks for sticking around.